Well, howdy, Aggies, and welcome to our voiceover for qualitative research. You can see an article in front of you there about ethics, corporate social responsibility, and the role of human resource development, the academic expert's view. So, before we start on that, I do want to talk a little bit about uh, some information about qualitative research. So, qualitative research obviously is quite different from quantitative research in terms of the type of data that's collected. There are other differences that we'll talk about, but for now, let's just focus on the differences in the data. Certainly, from a quantitative perspective, your data is numerical, so things that you measure numerically, knowledge scores, percent body fat, productivity in terms of dollars amount, or those types of things. From a qualitative perspective, the data is not numerical. It is words and phrases and texts, and which is again certainly different than quantitative data. So let me go through a few terms for you before we start looking at this article. The first thing about qualitative research that I want you to know, just big global picture, is that qualitative research looks at real world experiences. So it kind of drills down into, we'll talk about case studies in a moment, we'll talk about phenomenological studies and ethnographies, but it really is looking at real world stories, in our case, of humans, because that's what we're interested in actually looking at. The example that I kind of use in class is if you have ever, or if you've grown up in a family of a lot of children, and particularly if there's a big gap between, like the oldest child and then the youngest child. So I've had students in class that have like a 28-year-old sibling, and then they have a sibling that's as young as 8. And my question to them is, do you think that the growing up experience of the 28-year-old is the same as the growing up experience of the 8-year-old? And most students would say, absolutely not. The 28-year-old was the first child, you know, very probably controlled by the parents. And then as other children come along, and here's this 8-year-old that probably they're less attentive to, and know that they're not going to, die if they eat a mud pie or something like that. So we all have our own experiences, and the example I'm using is within a family context. And so that's what qualitative research kind of looks at. Qualitative research takes place in natural settings. So a lot of times we think about quantitative research, particularly the most basic of quantitative research, like medical research, is happening in a lab. So if there's a new drug that's coming out, scientists might um, see how mice or different animals react to certain drugs. And that's a very controlled setting, in a lab setting. Qualitative research happens in a natural setting, so in the real world. So at a corporate office, or in a school setting, or there's qualitative research related to sports teams, so in the gym or on the football field. And then another item to be sort of aware of is that, unlike quantitative research, which is really interested in sort of the product, so it's product oriented, what's happening at the end of this study. So if we're talking about gum chewing versus no gum chewing and studying, we're not really worried about what's going on during the process of the people chewing gum, memorizing words, those types of things. We just want to know at the end who can memorize more words: people who have chewed gum when they've studied, people who haven't chewed gum. And again, that's very different from qualitative research, because qualitative research is process oriented. It wants to know what happens at the end, certainly, but what happens in the intermediate steps to get to what happens at the end. So another example of something that would be interesting to study from a qualitative perspective is what are the feelings of female cadets in the Corps of Cadets at Texas A&M. So if you can think back to when females were first allowed to be in the Corps, um, it would be interesting to go back and talk to some of those first females and see what their feelings were, and their 4 years in the Corps, and what happened to them during those 4 years, and how it ended up. We could compare that to, someone that happened to 15 years ago, and then we could compare that to what's going on with females now that are in the Corps. So, not just interested in what the end product is, but what actually is happening during the process to get to that end. In terms of the types of studies that are conducted, um, the first one I'll talk about is a case study, and the kind of verbiage you want to attach to that is that it is a bounded system. So a case study of a single person's experience, a small group's experience. So one of the examples I typically use is, let's say that we have a basketball player who is a very poor free throw shooter, and so his coach, his athletic department, finds a sports psychologist that works with that athlete starting, let's say, in September or August before the basketball season starts, and they work with him or her, improving their free throw shooting throughout the year. Well, that's the bounded system. This particular player in this particular season and this particular set of circumstances, trying to improve his or her free throw shooting throughout the basketball season. Another type of qualitative study is called an ethnography. An ethnography is like the study of cultures. So if you can think of Jane Goodall, some people may have heard about her. She was the lady who famously went out and lived with gorillas in Africa and really studied the culture of pods of gorillas, and I think that's actually what it's called, a pod, and kind of the hierarchy within that system, that culture, where there was a sort of an alpha male gorilla that was, kind of led the group, and then the positions of the positions of different other gorillas within that culture or hierarchy, and then what happened when that alpha male, that in charge male, got older and younger gorillas came up and took that gorilla's place, and how did that actually occur? And so there's some very anthropological studies that are ethnographies of the culture of gorillas and the hierarchy of gorillas in the wild. Another type of study is called a phenomenological study, and this is where the researcher actually studies like a group of people, and I'm really going to focus more on an event. So the example that I typically use when talking about a phenomenological study is, what was it like to be in New York City on 9/11? And typically, or there's some argument that would suggest or think that someone could not or should not study that phenomena unless that was a lived experience for them. So people would argue that if someone wanted to study what was it like to be in New York City on 9/11, that study should be conducted by someone who was actually there and lived that experience. And if you kind of think about it, to me, it sort of makes sense that that's something that would be probably relevant and important, as opposed to someone coming from California or coming from outside the United States that didn't live that experience. And so, but a phenomenological study looks at an event. Generally speaking, it kind of has a beginning and an end. And so I think that lived experience of what was it like to be, in New York City on 9/11 and the aftermath of the attacks there is an example of something that might be studied through that. Another one is descriptive and interpretive, or descriptive interpretive, and I'm using that terminology because the article that we're going to look at here in a moment actually uses that methodology, and it kind of cuts across case studies, ethnographies, phenomenological studies, but the key here is that obviously new data is collected, and it does look at things from a surface level, so that descriptive. But then the researchers actually do take a deeper dive and try to interpret their data that they've collected. So a little bit of information about that type of study. let me talk a little bit before we get started again on the types or the ways that data is collected from a qualitative perspective. The first one is interviews. Um, so an interview could be of a single person, it could be of a group of people. There are different types of interviews. So structured would be where here are the 10 questions we're asking, and we're asking no more. We could also do semi-structured interviews. That's where you start with a set of interview questions, but you open yourself up to being able to delve more deeply into what others, what responses that people have made that you're interviewing, and so you can ask follow-up and more in-depth questions. That's what you see most often. You will be completing an interview, and it will be in a semi-structured interview. So I'll give you some interview questions, but then you'll be required to actually add to that list of questions depending on what your participant actually answers to some of the questions. And then another thing I'll talk a little bit about is focus group. A focus group is quite often used in qualitative research. It is a group of people that are interviewed at the same time. And I've been a part of both sides of focus groups. I've been the interviewee, and I've also been interviewed as part of a focus group. And I think the major thing that's a positive about focus groups is that the individuals that you choose to put on your focus group should be very specifically selected. And one of the things that I've found that's a benefit of a focus group is that the members of that focus group sort of play off what other people say. So I've been in situations where I was the interviewee and we were talking to 6 or 8 people, and we asked a question, and it's like no one really wanted to start talking. And then eventually we kind of kept following up and kept following up and kept following up. And then almost, the floodgates opened, so to speak, and one person started talking about, the questions we were asking, and then we couldn't get people, all of a sudden everybody's hand went up because they wanted to add something to it. So I think a focus group can be something that's really important to use because people can play off one another. Depending on what you're asking of your people, I think you have to also be careful about your focus groups, because if you create a focus group that has different levels of members of a work environment, so high level managers, mid level managers, low level managers, people that are in the warehouse types of things, and you're trying to evaluate a leadership or a leadership style, those lower level people may not feel as comfortable expressing their true feelings around some of the upper level members of a management team, versus if you had a focus group of just your sort of warehouse workers, and then you might get more honesty, and then your mid or your lower level managers or your mid-level managers. So again, just sort of be careful if you use focus groups, because you need to really think about the composition of those and the types of questions and information you're trying to get. The second way that data is collected from a qualitative perspective is observation. So the researcher simply goes out and observes behavior. So you see a lot of observations that take place in classroom settings, so in educational settings. Depending on how much psychology you've had, there's been a lot of observational research that's taken place in factory, watching people do their jobs, and there's some interesting phenomena that come about when factory workers are being observed. So there's any number of types and places where observations take place. You'll be actually completing an observation for our class, so there'll be some instructions that are available to you that are separate from this, but in fact, you'll do both an interview and an observation just to give you a feel of how to collect qualitative data. And then the third way is what's referred to as document analysis. And that's where you use written documents related to the phenomena that you're studying. So if we were doing the phenomenological study of what was it like to be in New York City on 9/11, um, we probably couldn't go back and observe anything because that was a one-time event, and unless we were there and really specifically collecting that data at that time, which most people weren't because that was not something that anyone knew was going to happen. But certainly we could go back and interview people. We could probably have some focus groups, etc. But from a document analysis perspective, we could go then and look at newspaper articles. We could look at governmental reports about what happened that day, um, magazine articles. Uh, if we were looking at it from how did certain companies react to the events of 9/11, we go in and look at employee handbooks, employee guidelines for handling emergency situations. So it just depends on what our kind of what we're asking about. But we would look at written words related to what happened in New York City from a perspective of 9/11. One last thing, and then we'll get into our article here, is about sampling. Um, Generally speaking, from a quantitative perspective, kind of 30 people is sort of a minimum number of people for us to really feel good about any results that we find from a quantitative perspective and in terms of generalizing back to an entire population. It's different for qualitative research. In fact, where we think of um, from a quantitative perspective, random selection, representative sample, uh, volunteers, convenient sample, some of those words that we talked about with quantitative research. From a qualitative perspective, we actually use purposeful sampling. And that means you purposefully go to the people who can answer your questions. You can't randomly select people to answer specific questions about whatever the phenomena is that you're studying. So back to the free throw perspective, we wouldn't randomly select basketball players on a team to work with a psychologist to try and improve their free throw shooting. We need to go to the person who needs that help the most. So we purposefully select someone who, needs that specific attention to improve his or her free throw shooting. So purposeful sampling is what you'll see in qualitative research. And then you will also typically see much smaller sample sizes, and we'll definitely see that here. So let's jump into the article. When we get down to the end of the article, there'll be some other terms that I'll kind of talk about. Some of them are mentioned in the article here, some are not. So we'll kind of look at them as we see them. So here's our article. Again, ethics, corporate social responsibility, and the role of human resource development. The academic expert's view. I found this online just sort of looking for articles that were qualitative in nature that I felt like were pretty easy to read. And as I found this one, it was interesting because 3 people that are in our department actually helped write this. The first and third are former graduate students in our department, and then Khalil Durrani is one of our faculty members that I get the privilege of working with day in and day out. So I thought that was interesting that I happened to find one that folks from our department actually talked about. So we'll talk about this, first of all, looking at it, how are quantitative and qualitative research articles similar? And so from a published research journal article, they're not going to look that much different. We had a title. We had a list of our authors. Remember, the authors are put in order of their contribution to the study. We have an abstract. Again, in this particular abstract, we have some delimitations or well, we do have some delimitations, but we have actually some headings: purpose, design methodologically, findings, originality value. And so there, this abstract happens to be sort of more organized. Some abstracts, again, are less organized where you don't actually have those headings. Keywords. So, again, very close to what we would see from a quantitative perspective. If we go back and think about IMRAD, introduction, methodology, results, discussion, we're still going to see those items here. So here is our introduction to the article. It is the review of literature, the background information. This particular article actually talks about, in its publication, the blue is all of the reference material. And so you can see all these outside sources are being brought in to sort of show the gap for this, the need for this. The introduction I've just talked about is sort of several paragraphs, and then they talk about the purpose. We decided to conduct qualitative research and interview HRD scholars to find out the relationship between HRD, ethics, and CSR, corporate social responsibility. So they had two questions. What do HRD scholars think about ethics and corporate social responsibility education for HRD graduate students? And what is the role in promoting ethics and corporate social responsibility in organizations? So they give a little brief situation here. They ended up interviewing 10 HRD scholars, and then the purposeful part of this that had influential publications related to HRD and ethics topics. So we'll see a little bit more of that. I highlighted it here because it was there, but we'll see a little bit more of that in the methodology section. So here is their true beginning of their review of literature. And I did kind of the same thing I did with the quantitative research, where I highlighted the very first sentence in each paragraph, because I think that notion of our upside down triangle still holds true here. So again, you start out very broadly in your review of literature, and then you start narrowing down until you come to the purpose of your study. So again, here, this is kind of interesting. In 350 BC, Aristotle stated that an ethical character can be obtained by practicing ethical behavior, and this practice can help individuals make the correct decision when they face challenging situations. Can you get more broad than that going back to 350 BC? I don't think that you can. And then, again, I'm not going to read each of these opening sentences in the paragraphs, but now these authors start talking about studies in ethical behavior in the workplace, so they sort of narrow it down, and now we're talking about in the 60s, so they're giving some historical perspective here. Again, some older research here, because they are specifically talking about historical perspective. In 2015, argued that employee ethics training are now institutionalized as a method to foster ethical organizational performance. Scholars have highlighted the connection of HRD, different ethical theories, so they give a list of those there. To comprehend the ethical capacity of HRD role, it's important to contextualize this within the organization in relation to organizational values. So they get ready to start talking about corporate responsibility. So again, relating this back to very specific HRD perspectives and duties, let's say. Mentioned, here's one Armitage mentioned there's a lack of ethical analysis within HRD practices, so we're coming on down. And so, we get down here at the bottom, and not the bottom, but the last paragraph, talking about corporate social responsibility and ethics, and so kind of the tie-in between those within HRD, And they're kind of showing a gap. So about the middle of this, while there have been several HRD scholars that address the importance of CSR, the link between HRD and service is not clear. And they goes on to talk about identify 4 dimensions of HRD that can help contribute to promoting CSR within organizations, and they're listed there. So again, very broad to begin with, and then start narrowing the focus down to sort of what's the scope and what's the purpose of this study. In terms of our M for methodology, again, a interpretive qualitative study to examine the linkage between ethics, corporate social responsibility, and human resource development. So again, I'm not going to read this. You have access to this. They give a little bit of background about why they chose to use qualitative research here. They talk about purposeful sampling because they wanted to go to the people who could actually give them in-depth, rich in-depth knowledge of the topic. And so that's another term that you'll hear quite a bit from or in reference to qualitative research, thick, rich descriptions. So in quantitative research, not a lot of adverbs and adjectives. When you start reading qualitative research, lots of adverbs, lots of adjectives, so that thick, rich descriptions give you your data, so to speak. So essentially what they did here is they reviewed the literature and they found 20 HRD scholars that had one or more than one publications related to ethics and social responsibility. They ended up reaching out to them, and I think they tried to get information from 13, but they ended up getting information from 10 of those. So again, purposeful. They looked at the literature, reviewed the literature, see who the true scholars were in this area. More than one article related to ethics training and social responsibility. They found 20, and then they reached out. They were able to get information from 10 of them. I will make a note. I did not highlight it, but note here, you can kind of follow the cursor in the article there. You can see that they did give a little bit of descriptive information. So 4 of the participants were male, 6 were female, 9 having 15 or more years of experience in academia. So they gave some information about ages, etc. So it's not uncommon to give a little bit of background information about your participants if it's possible. So we'll come on down in our methodology here, and they talk about interviewing and how powerful that is. So they did semi-structured interviews, and they talked about, again, I've got it highlighted here, that it allows for some flexibility. So as the researcher, you can have the same questions that you're going to ask every participant, but then you're allowed as the researcher to ask follow-up questions to let your participants actually elaborate. The next section, they talked a little bit about what each author did in terms of the getting the study off the ground, and how they kind of divvied up the work, if you will. And again, here's some more information about follow-up questions were made to clarify ambiguous responses. So they allowed that. So interestingly, when you think about data from a quantitative perspective, you're going to have columns of data. Many of you just got through going through HRD 391, column of data, column of data, column of data. We know how to deal with that. Are we looking at describing that data? Are we looking at strength of association if we have a X and a Y? If we have 2 columns of data and each of those are different groups, are we looking at significant differences between your groups? Well, here the data is quite different, and so the data is words, and so it's very important that when you interview individuals, that you do record your data and then transcribe it. So they here talk about transcripts of the interviews, and they, in fact, this whole paragraph right here would really be kind of the data analysis section, if you will. So they don't really have a section here where they talk about how they analyze the data other than this right here. So it doesn't have a separate heading, but basically the data is transcribed and then it is poured over, meaning read, reread by all of the members of the team. They do that separately. And then they start categorizing the data by what they'll call coding. And so in qualitative research, given that the data is words, not numbers, the researchers individually read, reread the transcripts, and they start kind of coding the data. Coding the data means putting similar statements together. So if you can think about, these guys had 10 different people that they asked semi-structured questions to, and so they had 10 transcripts of these interviews that they were reading over and over, and then as they read them multiple times, they started coding the data. And so they started putting common statements together, and then they would again continue to read and refine those categories. They established the validity, were these responses answering the questions that were being asked? And I'll come back in a minute and talk a little bit about the trustworthiness, but you do want to establish trustworthiness of the data. And there's ways that you can do that with your participants. And then they start kind of identifying keywords, so words that are used multiple times by different individuals that are being interviewed, and then they start putting them into major themes. A couple other terms that are listed here. Going into this research, the researchers can have some preset thoughts about what they're going to hear, but then they are also looking to or at emergent categories. So what are the themes that were not part of these preset categories, but that come about because your participants that you're interviewing state them, and that emerge during the collection of the data. So let me stop there and talk a little bit about some other terms, and then we'll look at the findings of this. And I might, if I were you, I might take some notes here. A term that you quite often see related to qualitative data collection is member checking. They don't talk about member checking here, but member checking is a way of establishing the trustworthiness of the data. So do I have good data? Are my transcriptions, are my observation notes, my field notes, are my notes I've taken from looking at document analysis, are my notes from the interview, are they really true as to what is being said? So a way to establish trustworthy is called member checking. Member checking actually is very specific to interview transcripts. So quite often, and again, they don't talk about it here, you interview someone, you transcribe that data, so you have a 5-page transcription of the data, you hand it to the person that you interviewed, and you ask them, can you read this, and is this what you said? So member checking is just having an interviewee read the transcript of their interview and say, yes, that is what I said. If they want to make corrections to what you wrote and transcribed, you allow them to make those changes. So member checking is a way of establishing trustworthiness. And again, trustworthiness is related to getting good data. Is your data valid? Another term that we'll talk about is triangulation. So if you can think about, a triangle has 3 angles, And if you think about the fact that qualitative research has three methods of collecting data: observation, interview, and document analysis. So, in the types of research that use all three, and some do, this one happened to use only interviews, but um, in qualitative research that does observations, does interviews, actually has documents that they can look at, the authors or the researchers would triangulate the data. And basically, what that means is what you're observing what people are saying? So if you're observing behaviors and then you interview people do is what you or does what you observed match up with what people say is happening? And does what you observed and what people are saying is happening match what you're reading if you have access to documents? So triangulating the data, making sure that what you see is what is being said, is what you read, is another way of actually um, ensuring the trustworthiness of the data. Another term that is often used is what's called constant comparison. Again, they don't use the terminology here, but when they talk about coding and then using these preset categories, that implies that they're using constant comparison. So these authors interviewed 10 people. They're telling us that they had some preset categories that they felt like that they were going to observe. And so once they started, excuse me, once they started reading the data and getting ready to code the data, they were constantly comparing what they were reading to these preset categories, but then also looking for some emergent categories. So constant comparison just means that as let's say they completed 2 or 3 of the interviews and they started probably transcribing and then reading the data, seeing what the 3 or 4 people said that fit into these preset categories, and then started looking for emergent categories. And then they interviewed some more people. And so then they're constantly comparing the preset categories to the first set of interviews to now these new interviews. Is what these people saying, do they fit into the preset categories? Does it match what other people are saying? And so this constant comparison is something that goes on throughout the process of qualitative research. And so does the emerging process. And so let me contrast that to quantitative data collection. So in quantitative data collection, I'll use our gum chewing. We're going to have people come in. One group is going to chew gum. The other group is not going to chew gum. They're going to either be chewing gum, not chewing gum. They're going to have 15 minutes to study the words. Everybody's going to have the words taken away from them. Everybody will have 15 minutes where they're not looking at the words. They may be reading a book. We may be showing everybody a 15-minute video on some topic. And then everybody's going to be given an empty piece of paper. Write down how many words you can remember. Each of those is very specific. Group chewing the gum, group not chewing gum. 15 minutes of studying the words, 15 minutes of doing some of their activity, and then 15 minutes to remember how many words you could remember. So that's very specific. An emergent process or emergent design means that we may go in, and authors may go in, or qualitative researchers may go in thinking that they're going to be looking at this question or these 10 questions or these, in this case, they looked at 2 research questions that we talked about at the very beginning. But that could actually change once they start getting into, the data and doing this constant comparison and doing observations and doing interviews. So emerging process is something that you see throughout qualitative research. Kind of very closely tied to that is recursiveness. Recursiveness meaning just continually to repeat the process. So repeating this collecting new data, comparing it to what you've seen. Is there anything that is new, emergent design? Now let's repeat that process. So we're going to, recursive, that's what that means. Let's repeat that process. Let's continue to repeat that process. And so if I were you, I would be sitting there saying, well, does this just go on to infinity? And the answer to that is no, it does not. You can A qualitative researcher will continue this new data collection until they reach what's referred to as data saturation. So data saturation comes about when there's no longer any new information that the researcher is gleaning. And so then typically at that point, the data collection actually stops. So those are the words. Again, some of those are sort of talked about that in this particular study. Some aren't, and some of them may be something that you see in other qualitative research that you read. So let's take a look at what the findings are. And so, there's kind of some very broad overall findings in this first paragraph. And the very first sentence is kind of interesting. The findings supported the longstanding argument that human resources professionals play an important role in the process of institutionalizing ethics in organizations. So they're kind of, again, tying what they found back to previous findings, previous literature. And I think if you read the rest of this paragraph, they kind of do that very globally and broadly. But that's, again, very similar to what you would see in quantitative research. And then what they go on to do is talk about the themes that they found, and there were 7 of them. And again, this probably goes back to their preset notions, their emergent notions, and then they parse them out, if you will, so that they found 7 distinct findings from these interviews. And I'm not sure because I don't really talk about the order that they put them in. The theme 1, human resource development curriculum, and the need for inclusion of ethics. Basically, what they found was, and they believe, is that people, in fact, at the graduate level need to have ethics courses there. I highlighted this particular passage. It's very true in qualitative research, particularly in your findings section, that you do quote specific passages from participants that are related to the theme in this case that they're talking about. So notice obviously that this person was not named, but as participant M noted, ethics is a universal discussion and needs to be included in any profession, any discipline. We are teaching future professionals where we are teaching future people in the workforce. And so you'll see throughout here's another one, participant G, who stated something. So it's not uncommon to see specific quotes from interviews, or maybe if you're talking about things that you learn from your observation. So here is the second one, second theme: role of human resource development practitioners in promoting organizational ethics. So again, they talk about that. We'll kind of zip through the rest of these themes because you can read back and talk about and see these. So there's number 3, number 4, support, executive support. When they get down to some of these other ones, corporate social responsibility initiatives. And again, I see some quotes throughout there. Number 6, corporate social responsibility initiatives not representative of ethics. So some thoughts from the people there. And then the last thing, Academy of Human Resource Development needs to promote standards for ethics. The Academy of Human Resource Development is the professional organization related to human resource development. And I want to move on because I do then have a discussion so that those items that we just saw were our findings or our results. So then again, they try to relate a lot of this back to previous research. But I do want to get to the end of this because like we see in quantitative research, The authors can find limitations, so they do talk about limitations here. So limitations here were to the 10 participants that they could get a hold of from North America, UK, and Portugal. The second one, the limitation, and this is true of all, and you'll read this throughout qualitative research, that unlike what we would think that we would hope that quantitative research is generalizable back to the population. So if you think about us trying to get information from Aggies about, do we want a fall break? We get information, we generalize it back to the population about what the feelings are of these 5 or 10,000 Aggies, as opposed to getting information from 70,000 Aggies. We generalize those findings back to all Aggies. Typically, we do not think of, in most cases, or many cases, we do not think of qualitative research as being generalizable back to an entire population, but we do think of it as possibly being transferable. But anyway, here they talk about readers must be cautious of our findings might not be generalized to other contexts because of the qualitative nature of our study. So again, this is something that you'll see in a lot of qualitative research, that it's not generalizable. And then they finish this off with some conclusions. And then again, like we saw in quantitative research, our references here. Again, I'm not sure what reference style this is, but it does not look like APA. So don't look at this and follow it as something that you're going to do for APA, because in APA, we don't have anything in quotation marks. We don't spell out volume, number, and PP. So again, we're talking about APA. So hopefully this has been something that's been educational for you, and you will have a qualitative article test. It will not be on this article. There will be a separate article that you'll need to be able to read and look over. And I hope you've enjoyed this video.